We have the numbers. The Congressional Budget Office yesterday releasing its 2015 long-term budget outlook, which shows, as our next guest will say, an unsustainable long-term path for debt. We want to put some perspective on it, so we are glad that Maya MacGuineas is with us. Maya MacGuineas is president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Tweets at Maya MacGuineas. I'll spell it out for you. Maya MacGuineas, welcome back to POTUS. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me this morning.
So for people who aren't familiar, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, makes a prediction, I guess, every year to tell us where the spending is going. Is this based on the suggested budgets? Is this based on real spending, appropriations bills that we've seen already passed? What's it based on?
So the Congressional Budget Office bases its projections, and these are interesting because they're longer-term projections. They go out for 25 and even 75 years. They base them on the current law. So a lot of the debates that are going on in Congress right now aren't worked into these numbers because you don't know what's going to get passed, what appropriations bills will be passed, what other changes will happen. So every time they come out with these projections, a couple times a year, they're based on what is in law right now. They also, just by the way, put out an alternative scenario which takes in a number of different assumptions based on the fact that there are a lot of things in current law that tend to not happen. So they don't call it their realistic projections, but they put out two sets of numbers, and one of them shows, well, if you didn't follow this law, and this law, the numbers, and in this case, the numbers would be even worse, and here's the projection.
So a more complicated version of playing with the mortgage calculator to find out how much your payment would be if the percentage rate was here or how much you put down and stuff like that.
It is. For budget wonks like myself, it's actually kind of interesting because it shows you, if you don't pay for extending these tax breaks, it's going to add this much to the debt. Or if you don't pay for this, a highway trust fund, it's going to add this much to the debt. So it shows you kind of the variables involved. But the bottom line for all these sets of projections is the debt is, as you said, on an unsustainable path. And the Congressional Budget Office, non-political entity, it just goes by the numbers. The facts are the facts here. And we have a debt that is projected to grow faster than our entire economy for the foreseeable future. And that's what unsustainable is, when your debt's growing faster than your economy. And it's going to reach the size of the full economy within 25 years, which is really not a good place where we want to be. It used to be that the average debt compared to the economy we had was less than 40%. And here we are headed to 100% with no plan to turn this situation around. And that is really a wake-up call to anybody who's kind of paying attention to the numbers.
And let's get specific with the numbers. According to the CBO, under current law, debt would remain relatively stable, about 74% of gross domestic product through 2020. Then it would start to rise continuously, 78% by 2025, 103% by 2040, 180% within 75 years. To your point, Maya MacGuineas, it's not just about whether or not the debt is growing, but there is no plan to even make any dents into it. We're still trying to figure out how to keep from having deficits every year. Forget about the debt. So I guess the question would be, what are the steps that need to be taken to do something about it?
Well, when it comes to the policies, we actually know the answers. They're not the things that politicians wanted to, but they're pretty straightforward. We need to look at all our parts of the budget. We need to think about how we're going to control the spending. We need to think about how we're going to reform our major entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, very important programs in this country. Also, all have made bigger promises than we have a plan for how to pay for. So we need to get those programs back on track. Disability actually is slated to run out of money in its trust funds next year, and we don't even have a plan. And finally, we know that you're going to have to deal with revenues. We're going to have to find a way to bring in more revenues to the government to pay for the bills. So we know that's what has to get done. What we don't know is politically how to get the folks in Washington to actually act responsibly. They're so busy fighting, and they're so busy trying to take the easy way out and not pay for things, we never own up to this. So I guess what I think is we have to have a conversation with the 2016 presidential race. We have to ask all of the candidates, Republicans, Democrats, independents, how they would address the debt, and ask them to make a real commitment that when they get into office, if they were to win, that they would put forth a budget that would actually address this and have a plan to bring the debt back down. I'm not saying pay it off. I'm not even saying balance the budget immediately. I'm saying get us just to a point where the debt's not growing faster than the economy, which is sort of the bare minimum we should be shooting for, and we should be able to expect that of everybody who's running for president.
Maya MacGuineas is with us, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And I want to get to something in the report that your group put together and get back to something you specifically mentioned a moment ago, which is revenues. You say that lawmakers could choose to reduce deficits solely by increasing revenues, which they're not going to do. But if they did, such a policy would require boosting revenues by 14% in each year over the 2016-2040 period. For households in the middle fifth of the income distribution in 2016, a 14% increase in all types of revenues would raise federal tax payments for that year by about $1,700 on average. Now, I'm trying to understand that. Are you saying that a 14% increase in the revenues to those families would mean that they would pay enough taxes to make that difference up? Maybe explain that better. I'm misreading it.
What we're saying is that if you wanted to fix this entire problem through increased taxes, then you would have to pay that much more in taxes every year.
Okay.
That shows the
so nobody wants that.
Nobody, first off, nobody wants any of these solutions. None of them, there's no free lunches here. But to talk about doing this all on the revenue side, especially at a time when most people are saying, listen, the middle class isn't doing very well. They're not really in a situation to pay significantly more in taxes right now until we get wages growing. That's not a very viable policy. So I think the point we're trying to make in our report is people who say they're not going to touch spending and people on the other side who say they're not going to touch revenues don't really have a credible plan to fix this. It is such a big problem, and it's going to take time, but it's going to take looking at all parts of the budget, and it's also going to take something that we don't do much right now, but compromise. It's going to take everybody sort of getting rid of their pledges, coming out of their trenches, and being willing to say, how about some revenues? How about fixing Social Security? How about cutting spending, but not as harshly as the sequester does, more smart, targeted savings, and sort of a thoughtful approach and a compromise.
Well, the larger problem, again, gets back to even when if you were to have more money coming in than going out, the question is, how do you then apply that to the debt as opposed to saying, oh, we've got a little bit of excess, maybe we'll just give it back to the voters, because that's been one approach in the past. And there's others to say, well, now we can increase our spending a little bit because we got more money coming in. That long-term problem seems to be second shelf most of the time. And quite frankly, with the numbers the CBO is saying it would stay short-term relatively stable, there will be no sense of an emergency. I mean, this long-term thing about 2025, 78%, that's still... By 2040, 130% or 103%, but that's 2040. That's 25 years away.
It's a great point. It's very hard to make people understand that this issue actually does affect all of us directly, and that with debt levels as high as they are, it actually slows the economy. That translates into all of us having lower wages than we would have. We have wages that are significantly lower than if we hadn't been running deficits for all these years. But it's a little bit of the frog in the boiling water, where he doesn't notice that the water's getting hotter and hotter and hotter until he's boiled.
Yeah.
This is this kind of thing where it eats away at our economy, our competitiveness, our individual wealth, the job situation in the U.S. It's related to all of these things, but drawing that connection is very hard to make. And as you say, there's no urgency. There's no crisis that's going to happen this year or next year if we don't make these changes. It's kind of a slow eating away at the fabric of our economy, which is why you need political leadership. You need somebody who's going to come up there on the national platform, and we've seen this happen in the past from both parties. Usually it's a bipartisan effort where they say, this is why we have to address this. If we let the debt sit there, it's going to continue at this level and grow. It's going to really drain our economy, paralyze us, hurt our competitiveness. Make the case that we're going to have to make some hard choices, talk about why it actually sets us on such a better path towards overall growth and prosperity in the country, which it's a key piece of doing that, and then bring the country together to be willing to make these choices. And our experience, because we're spending a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire and where the different candidates are going, is that voters really understand that. And if they had people, instead of promising them more programs and promising them tax cuts and not saying how they pay for any of these things, but if they had people coming out and talking about why it's better for families, households, the country, our children, that's really the most important part of this, right? This is leaving a strong economy for our kids. There are a lot of voters who understand that and would like to see somebody who would come into office who would actually be willing to make those changes.
It's so nice to hear you talk about serious discussions during a presidential campaign. It would be so lovely, wouldn't it?
It would be really nice. You look at other countries, and some of them manage to have them. A national discussion on pressing issues is what a campaign should be for. And I think we're all so sick of political attack ads and sort of substance-free discussions. This is something, certainly in the debates, I would really like to see our moderators hold the candidates accountable and ask them for real answers to the questions of what they would do to deal with the debt.
Maya MacGuineas, I appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us on POTUS today.
Thanks so much.
Maya MacGuineas is president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Reaction to the CBO's numbers that are out, the long-term budget outlook, and we ran over some of those numbers. And I'll tell you what, it's pretty scary if you look at it in the long-term context, but we don't often do that. So we will link it on our Facebook page, facebook.com/POTUS Politics, if you'd like to read the analysis. And you can always tweet at Maya MacGuineas. It's at Maya MacGuineas, at MAYAMACGUINEAS.